Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Today we have national security officials, we have security pros, we have cryptographers, all here to talk about ways to strike a balance between US national security and consumer security and privacy. So up first we have Amy Hess. She is the Executive Assistant Director of the FBI Science and Technology Branch. She oversees 3 divisions, the Criminal Justice Information Services, and Operational Technology divisions, and the FBI Lab. She'll kick us off with a few remarks, and then we'll get to questions, and I do want to get to audience questions as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and appreciate the invitation to be here to talk about this very important topic this morning. So the FBI really views the going dark issue as having been a concern for us for a number of years, and it's well beyond encryption. It basically summarizes the issue we have with the proliferation of technology over the years and how that might be impacting our ability to do our job, our ability to get information, evidence, or leads in criminal investigations or national security investigations. And so as we see this proliferation of technology, we see that pace accelerating. And so to that point, we have actually been more and more vocal about the issues we're seeing, the concerns we're having, the challenges that we're encountering with respect to being able to do our job. So as I said, the going dark problem is more than just encryption. When we refer to going dark, we're referring to encryption on, for example, data in motion, data that's transported across networks, real-time type of electronic surveillance that we must do in the course of our investigations. We also view it as a challenge with encryption on data at rest, stored data. We also view it as a challenge when it comes to mobility. So people will bounce back and forth between, for example, cellular service, Wi-Fi service, back and forth. And that presents a challenge to us as well. And then anonymity is another challenge. So when we see the anonymization of the attribution, so that we're unable to identify who is actually behind the specific information that we're trying to seek in the course of an investigation, that presents a challenge to us. And then in addition to that, we also see, for example, when we have foreign companies that aren't subject to US law, that presents a challenge to us as well. And so with more and more technology companies that are in other countries, we see that as a challenge also. And we also see a challenge with respect to data retention. So many companies won't keep data, or they'll only keep it for a very, very limited period of time. Maybe it'll disappear as soon as you send a message, and that presents a challenge to us. So all of those things factor into what we refer to as the going dark problem. But I wanted to focus here just a few minutes on just what we're seeing more and more, why we've been more vocal about this really in the past year, is because we've seen this proliferation of technology, and at the same time we see that people are really living more and more on their electronic devices. The information we used to keep in paper or in file cabinets or in desk drawers or in our homes are really now more and more on our electronic devices. And the same goes for the bad guys, the people that we're trying to target. We have a remit to identify and to root out the individuals who are either engaged in criminal activity or terrorist activity and trying to prevent those threats from happening or trying to bring those people to justice. But in order to do that, we have to get access to their electronic information because that's where we live as a society more and more. And so with that, obviously we see our existing authorities, Title III under the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, which gives us the authority to intercept real-time communications. We also have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, does the same thing with national security investigations, search warrants, criminal search warrants, and being able to access devices. All of those orders signed by a judge that enables us to get access, or at least authorizes us to get access. Unfortunately, we're unable to execute them more and more because of this increasing problem, this increasing issue and challenge that we have in our investigations due to the proliferation of technology. But with all that said, I do want to make it very clear here today that we don't have a solution to that, and we're not proposing a solution to that. In our opinion, from the government's perspective, we really need the companies to try to come up with the solutions, to try to build the most secure systems, yet at the same time, when presented with an order, with a search warrant, or with a court order signed by a judge, that we're able to get the information that we're seeking, the evidence, the data in readable text, so that we're able to effectuate our mission in order to protect public safety.
Great. So I do want to ask you some questions about the broader going dark challenges facing the FBI. But to start, let's go with encryption. And you have companies like Apple, for instance, which have moved to deploy stronger protections by default, so strong that they say the company itself can't even get access to the data. So let's distill what we're actually talking about here. We have law enforcement officials such as yourself talking about getting warranted access to encrypted data. You have some tech companies saying that's actually a backdoor. This is a built-in weakness for the government to access otherwise strong encryption. And you have Director Comey and NSA Chief Mike Rogers talking about a front door with big locks. Cryptographers might say that's impossible. So why don't you start by outlining some of the specific encryption challenge. What is the problem as the FBI views it, and the proposals that have been flying around Washington?
Sure. So I think, again, the ability for us to be able to get readable text, the information that we need in order to further an investigation, in order to prevent an attack, or in order to bring someone to justice for a crime that they committed, that's the piece that is at issue. Mm-hmm. And for the encryption piece of the discussion that we've been having, the issue comes down to whether or not the company is able to build in some type of solution so that when served with a warrant, we can actually get that information. And whether we're talking about real-time communications, data in motion, we refer to it, or stored communications, data at rest, the matter comes down to being able to access that. So in order to access that information, the question is, how are we able to do that in the most secure way? Now, I think starting with the premise that in the society we currently live in, I think it's a misconception to think that so many systems are already 100% secure, because they already have some type of way, many of them, to access that data for market reasons, because they may want to be able to use that information to be able to push us, for example, targeted advertisements, or to be able to protect us from threats, or to be able to get that information for some other consumer-based need. But at the same time, for us to say that whether it's a back door, a front door, whatever that access point is, the question comes down to whether or not the government should be proposing those types of solutions, or, in our opinion, it should really be the providers who know their systems the best, who are able to build in some type of accessibility in order to build into their systems the most secure form of being able to access the information yet still protect it.
So in the kind of strong encryption that companies like Apple and Google and even Yahoo are moving to implement, what is the specific problem? So you get a warrant, you would like to access the data that's on let's say it's an iPhone. What happens in that process that is holding up law enforcement from getting that data?
Sure. So when it comes to stored communications, for example, data at rest, we see the issue with, and we've presented a number of examples in the past, but I'll start with a past example where, for example, we have a case. We had a case involving a child pornographer who eventually was communicating with individuals. And based on a photograph that they had transmitted, that we were able to actually, after the fact, we got access to that person's iPhone in this example. We were able to see this photo, and we got the GPS metadata location information off of that particular photo. Based on that information, we were then able to research that further, identify where that person was from, where they had actually taken that photo, and then that investigation led us to eventually identify additional victims that person had molested. And all of these individuals, these children, were under the age of 8 years old. The investigation continues, but without that information that we were able to get from that iPhone, if he had had an upgraded operating system, we might not have been able to do that. At the same time, I'll give you another example where we have a homicide investigation where an individual is shot and killed after answering the door. This particular victim actually had the upgraded system. And when the police, and of course there's now no one to serve the warrant on in order to get access to the device, that victim had not disclosed her passcode to anybody else, including her family members. And so as a result, the police were unable to access that particular device to try to find clues as to who might have been responsible for her murder.
So how big of a scale, what's the scale of this problem? I mean, you have a New York district attorney who's saying that in 80% of the cases involving iPhones running iOS 8, law enforcement was unable to access that data, but that turned out to be 74 times. And so that's, of course, over the example, in this example is 9 months, 1 year, but is this happening everywhere, and do you expect this problem to only increase?
Yes. So I will be the first person to tell you that we've done a really bad job of collecting empirical data. And we need to do a much better job of that, because the problem has been in the past several-fold. One is that, for example, we can refer to the annual wiretap report. The annual wiretap report reports on how many wiretaps were authorized in the United States the previous year. It also asks a question about how many times encryption was encountered. The problem with that, and the fallacy that that data is built on, when we see that, well, we only encountered encryption maybe a handful of times in the thousands of wiretaps that were conducted by federal and state officials last year. The problem is, if I could take a moment to explain, to get a Title III, to get a wiretap, it's a very prolonged, deliberate process. Essentially, what you have to do is show that you have probable cause to believe that a person's committing a crime, and they're using that specific communication service to commit that crime. So in order to do that, that requires a lot of background investigation and a lot of explanation to a judge. Not to mention the levels of headquarters, FBI headquarters authorities that we have to go through, Department of Justice authorities. So what that means and what that translates to is that an agent's not going to pursue all of those things if they don't think they're going to get anything out of it at the other end. So for them to pursue a Title III, a wiretap, on a particular individual, if they think that individual is using some type of communication service that is encrypted and they're not going to get anything anyway, they're not going to pursue it. And we have that same problem when it comes to, obviously, what we're seeing across the board. We are seeing an increasing problem. We need to do better at capturing the data, but obviously things like the annual wiretap report kind of present the problem. Our investigators aren't going to pursue something that's that challenging, if you will, if they don't think they're going to get anything out of it in the end.
And so there are some who say that there's actually more information available to law enforcement than ever before because of the proliferation of technology, that this is another result of that. That law enforcement, for instance, could collect metadata, which includes telephone records and location data, but aren't these tools enough?
That's a great question. I think that personally, I've had discussions with all of certainly the FBI field offices to have enough knowledge of how we investigate. And of course, having been in those field offices myself and having investigated a number of different violations, agents will always try to get the information they need in order to effectuate our mission, to protect public safety, to bring someone to justice, to prevent a threat from happening. So they're going to try everything possible to try to get that information. In some cases, if we're stymied by encryption, if we're stymied by the just inability to get information in really the most effective way, being able to directly access a device or access a real-time communication, we're going to try to find a way around it, but we're not always successful in that. And so sometimes the problem is that even if we can get to it, it might not be timely. We have lots of examples of where, for example, we could have got the information. If we'd had the capabilities, we could have got it a lot quicker. The problem is, if that's a life or death situation, are we okay with it taking weeks or possibly months or possibly never getting that information?
And so what about those who say that law enforcement should bear the responsibility for just being faster at getting this data? I mean, what about just creating hacking teams, for instance, to try to break into the data once it's been collected?
Yeah, another great question. So certainly that's an avenue to consider and discuss. But I guess my first reaction to that is that to get a Title III, to get a wiretap, we are to prove to a judge that we have exhausted all less intrusive means. To me, hacking sounds like a pretty intrusive means to be able to get the information. But on top of that, the problem is even the hacking piece. So we might be able to get a specific target on a specific communication service on a specific communication device, but if they change that device or if they upgrade to the latest operating system, they decide they don't like that communication provider anymore, it's very fragile and it may not be timely. Again, it might take us a while to figure out how to get into that device to begin with. And when lives are in the balance, that's our concern.
And so how much of this is a resources concern too? I mean, both on a national level, but also for the state and local police agencies that are also dealing with these concerns.
Yeah, and especially for the state and locals, is that certainly we have the advantage of having clearly, especially under my branch, a lot of really, really smart technologists, engineers who can help think through these problems and think through these challenges. We communicate with our law enforcement partners on a daily basis, but the problem is that even if we might be able to solve a specific problem, even though it might take us a while to get there, the state or local police departments may never be able to have that luxury, to have those types of people employed or available to them to be able to do the same thing.
So Tim Cook, earlier this summer at another conference in Washington, said that he's the CEO of Apple, and he said, if you put a key under the mat for the cops, a burglar can find it too. So are you worried at all about the security risks if law enforcement does get some sort of channel to access encrypted data?
I'm worried about security risks in general. The FBI, and just to be clear, is the FBI supports strong encryption because clearly we also have the remit for when it comes to bringing people to justice or identifying or preventing threats. That includes cyber threats. Right. And so we send out messages encouraging companies and people to adopt strong encryption. At the same time, the concern for us is how do we get a secure system and then at the same time still be able to get the information, the evidence that we need when served with a warrant signed by a neutral judge to a company. And to us, it shouldn't be so much the government proposing the solution as it should be the service provider or basically a coalition, a collaboration between perhaps the academics, the companies, and the government to try to come up with the best, most secure solution to be able to do that thing.
And you bring up a good point because this debate is coming at a time where it seems like, at least to a cybersecurity reporter, that there are data breaches happening all the time in both the government and the private sector. Encryption is seen as a best practice to protect sensitive or just any information. So do you see how do you see the relationship between what you're asking for and the need to protect data? Do you see that at all in tension?
Yes, I think that certainly to protect data, to protect people's communications, I think that goes back to just our first premise, which is that we want to protect the communications, we want to protect the data, we want people to be secure in those systems for all the reasons I previously stated, but we also want to be able to get to the information with a warrant. And so when we do that, the question comes in as to what's the best way to go about doing that? How do we get the information that we need, but yet make sure that nobody else, or at least people who build these systems, can make it as secure as possible so that it limits. There will always be a risk, and I will readily admit that there will always be a risk when someone other than the sender and the receiver can get that information. But at the same time, since we have those systems in place today, how can we continue to mitigate that risk? And how can we minimize that risk so that we can get that information?
So what have your conversations been like with the private sector? Because many security companies and tech companies are worried that this could have business implications for them as well, that if they already have this kind of strong encryption, to modify it in some way so that law enforcement can get access to the data could hurt them. What has the discussion been like from your end?
Yeah, and we talk to the companies all the time. Matter of fact, daily, we have conversations with the companies to try to figure out the best way to get the information that we need in the course of an investigation. Certainly, they're concerned, and they have very clearly very legitimate concerns about if we build this capability in, how less secure will that make our system? And we want to work with them to try to find out, okay, well, how do we minimize that risk? It is a concern to them. At the same time, we're trying to balance, and that's, I think, what we've been trying to do, is to balance the discussion to say, here are the two things at play, and what is the American public comfortable with when it comes to either going too far, perhaps one way, or too far the other way when it comes to being able to access data, but at the same time presenting some risk inherent with that.
And do you think that if there is some kind of channel to access data, that other countries are going to want the same thing as the U.S. government is asking for now?
I think that that's always a concern. Certainly, that's part of our constant daily discussions. We've had a lot of conversations with other countries who clearly want that information. Our allies in other countries certainly have the same concerns and challenges with respect to their national security and law enforcement investigations that we do, and they want access to that data. The question is, how do you differentiate between what perhaps a country with good human rights records are and countries perhaps that don't have those good human rights records, for example? And then at the same time, if you're a U.S. company subject to U.S. law, what are the obligations versus a foreign company that's not subject to U.S. law?
And so tell me more about that. Do you think that companies should have to give other countries demanding that access if they do, and if this policy goes into effect, and let's say the UK would like to have similar access, or China? And are you sympathetic that this might put them in a more of a political or diplomatic role almost?
I think it is a very political discussion because, again, we have to balance all equities. The question is, how might we be able to allow law enforcement to do its job, and particularly in the countries that are certainly requesting access, they want to try to do their job too, but when it comes to being able to access that data, that is a huge policy discussion as to how are we able to limit that? Do we need to limit that? How do we go about even having the discussion of how to limit that? And that brings up the broader policy discussion about how we might see ourselves in the future when it comes to U.S. companies. Obviously, clearly have the lion's share of the market when it comes to new technologies. And by doing business in this country, does that mean that you are subject to certain rules and laws that are not shared by other countries?
And so you had brought up human rights as well. Are you concerned that if other countries do get this kind of capability, that it could affect people's overall ability to communicate securely?
Sure. I think that any country with poor human rights records might have there may be the risk of those countries getting access through some type of vulnerability in those systems to people's communications that certainly should be protected. In this country, certainly that's why we have the laws, the Constitution in place that protects from that. But that is certainly a concern, and again, it goes back to the policy discussion about how are we going to be able to discern between countries with poor human rights records versus those who don't have that issue, and who will be subject to what laws.
And I do want to ask you just one more question before we go to audience questions about, you'd mentioned how the number of devices is obviously increasing and the apps that people use, secure or just in general to communicate. So walk me through what is happening now as you're investigating, say, a criminal or a terrorist, and how that's become more difficult for law enforcement to track their communications.
Right. So in the course of, for example, a terrorism investigation, counterterrorism investigation, what we're seeing is more and more that individuals, for example, associated with ISIL, to be able to recruit the Islamic State, to be able to recruit, to entice individuals, will use open social media platforms. But then after seeing that person might be receptive to more conversation, they'll try to move them to other social media platforms that we are unable to access. And so what we see there is this this going dark challenge, this going dark issue, where now we've got to figure out, once that happens, how do we get past that? Is there another way? For example, do we introduce a human source, a confidential informant into the picture? Do we introduce an undercover into the picture? Does that work? If it doesn't work, what would? Maybe physical surveillance. Maybe there's another way to go about getting that information. The problem is, while we're trying to figure that out, is obviously we're wasting time and we're using more resources to get that information, which may never come to fruition. And so our concern and our fear, and I think what keeps us up at night, is that to be able to effectuate our mission, we may not know who's communicating in that fashion. We don't know how many people are already there that we're just unaware of.
Great. Well, so I do want to turn it over to the audience for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and remember to say your name and where you're from. Yes, in the back.
Thanks. This is Eli Lake from Bloomberg View. I just wanted to get your view on whether you're particularly concerned about some of the technologies developed by OpenWhisper, particularly as it applies to WhatsApp, and how easy it has been making for iPhone and Android users to use this kind of encrypted space. And do you think that some of these terrorist groups that you're tracking are now taking advantage of that technology?
I can answer the last question. I do think that terrorists and others who pose a threat to us are taking advantage of the proliferation of technology that they know, and it's been well publicized as to what communication methods we are unable to access. I can't speak as to specific capabilities or companies, but at the same time, we do see that in the course of our regular investigations, and we see the communications we can see, or perhaps that we get through human sources, will tell us that people are having conversations. The subjects of these investigations actually communicate and tell each other, use this application, use that application. And we do see those types of communications, not only in national security investigations, but in criminal investigations as well. So yes, it is a concern.
Yes, in the front.
Yes, how would you address...
Sorry, Alyssa, wait for the mic, and would you mind introducing yourself as well?
My name is Alyssa Shavinsky. I wrote an article on crypto backdoors for CSM Passcode. How would you respond to the concerns raised by Alex Stamos that crypto backdoors or special keys, how do we grant them only to the United States and not also to our other corporate friends? We do business in China and Russia and many other countries that clearly it's against national security interest.
Mm-hmm. And again, I think that goes back to our conversation about the larger policy discussion. But I want to clarify up front again is that I do not, and we do not, view this to be a one-size-fits-all solution. We don't view it as contrary to, I think, some of the conceptions that are out there. The government isn't promoting a golden key that will be the solution for all companies. That's why I think it would be up to each individual provider to come up with what is the most secure solution for them that still achieves the end result, which is just to get us the readable data. And with that said, the second part of the question is essentially that larger policy discussion of how do we make sure that U.S. companies, that U.S. data is subject to those types of that type of access. But at the same time, considering what other countries may ask for, how can you factor that into the larger policy discussion? And that's a source of ongoing debate.
Yes, Julie on the left there. There you go.
Hi, Nathan White with the Digital Rights Group Access. If not here and now, where and when do you foresee that larger conversation taking place?
About the access issues.
About the larger policy question, which you've referenced
right.
multiple times.
And there are daily discussions occurring, I think, about that type of thing. We certainly are concerned about it. We tee that up with respect to any type of interagency discussions. Certainly here in Washington, we've had a number of discussions in the interagency process with a number of different agencies, all impacted stakeholders in the government, to have that discussion. And so while we don't have answers at this point, those discussions are occurring.
Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Erin Kelly with USA Today. Congress has been having some hearings on this encryption issue. Would you like to see them get involved with legislation, or do you think that that would do more harm than good?
I think the ongoing discussions that we've been having essentially are such that we want to just bring the topic to the forefront without advocating for legislation at this time, but to also not take it off the table. I think that right now the idea and our goal is to ensure everybody understands what's at stake, the risks on both sides, and the equities on both sides. And so currently that is our goal without declaring whether or not we are seeking or pursuing or need that additional legislation.
Greg Otto from FedScoop. You said that you talk to these companies daily about the best ways to get information, and the FBI has been talking about this for a year, and you keep saying that you want to have this, put this discussion out there on the forefront. And if you're talking to the companies daily, I'm wondering your opinion on the reaction that you get from the companies when you say that you need to be able to get around their encryption.
The answer is it depends. It depends on the company. Clearly, some companies may not have, especially smaller companies, may not have the resources or capabilities. Some aren't subject to mandates like CALIA, the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, so they don't have to build in that type of access. Of course, most companies want to help. They want to, of course, be able to stop a threat or to be able to bring a perpetrator to justice. But at the same time, if they're not mandated to do it, the question comes down to do they need to take those resources and divert them to build in some type of access, or at the same time, do we have companies that really it wouldn't be part of their market plan to do that? And even if they want to cooperate, it may take years to be able to build in some type of access solution. So all of those dynamics at play, most companies will try to help us with what information they can provide, but it may not be really the solution that we're looking for.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, right here. And then we'll go to Dave.
Hi, Russell Shao, I'm a law student here in Washington, D.C. My question is about, in the context of law enforcement cooperation, when in a scenario where data may be stored physically outside the United States, some tech companies like Microsoft have argued that the government should pursue this data through mutual legal assistance treaties. Could you comment on the sort of efficacy of the MLATs, what the process is like, and there have been some calls that it needs to be updated or reformed. What do you think is the sort of the approach to this issue?
Yeah, clearly, we have challenges with MLATs and with the ability to get information in a timely fashion. Sometimes those processes may take months, if not years, to get the information. Sometimes they're just ineffective. Sometimes they're effective, but that seems to be more on the rarity side. So I do think that this presents that challenge for us as to if it's U.S. data in the course of a U.S. investigation, and we're seeking U.S. data in furtherance of an authorized investigation pursuant to a warrant that's been signed by a judge, then what is the discussion from, what is the appetite, if you will, by the American public to say that the company should have to provide that information? And really that's the debate that we're having at the moment. That's the discussion that we're having at the moment to find out what is the right balance and how do we get that information? What is the right mechanism to get that information?
And so, Julie, we in the third or fourth row here.
Hi, Dave Purr from Politico. So Chinese firms Huawei and ZTE essentially are persona non grata in the U.S. over concerns that Chinese authorities can access the contents of the communications that they're transmitting. What if it becomes apparent that U.S. firms are offering the same ability to U.S. authorities? irrespective of whether the Chinese or the Russians or any other parties can also access them, what effect do you think that'll have on the U.S. technology industry?
Again, I think that's a great question. How do we, in the course of a U.S. investigation with a U.S. company, U.S. data, strictly limit ourselves to it all being about U.S. investigations and what the U.S. needs access to? Because the question naturally comes up as to other countries wanting that data too. And how do you differentiate between when you have, for example, an investigation in the UK that presents a legitimate need in the course of a national security investigation or a law enforcement investigation versus another country who may not have the same type of relationship or same type of, human rights record or whatever it might be with respect to what they're going to do with that type of information. That is the larger policy discussion in this, and how do we think about that? Do we, and this point, again, I think that we need to have that more open discussion. What's the right solution? We don't have that solution right now. We don't have the right solution for what should be mandated. Should it even be mandated? Are we comfortable with the place we're in now, where the pendulum, I think, has swung so far post-Snowden that we've come to a place where we're continuing to see, at least from the law enforcement perspective, we're continuing to see society as a whole go to a place where more and more people are going to be above the law. And if that's the case, are we comfortable with that as a society? That's the larger question. And then the second question is, what do we do about it if we're not comfortable?
Okay, great. And we have time for, I think, a few more questions right here. Julie?
Hi, I'm Jenna McLaughlin with The Intercept. I'm curious if the FBI is concerned if these companies, if you get them to agree to some sort of backdoor to build in some sort of capability, are you concerned that other companies, maybe darker companies, kind of criminal entities, might still provide these sort of end-to-end encryption, and it'll primarily just be the average American user that loses out and no longer can protect their communications, while criminals still might find access to these things?
I think that, and really the experience that we've had in this is, if companies can build in such a way, and that's why, again, I go back to it shouldn't be the government that's proposing the solutions, is that, really the companies know their systems better than anybody. And so in our opinion, really it should be, the requirements should come from the government. Look, this is what we're trying to accomplish. But really the companies to be able to build in the most secure systems, to be able to build the most secure systems, to be able to do that. With that said, I think the very tech-savvy people that are out there are going to figure out ways to take advantage of any vulnerability, as they do today, currently. We currently live in a society where clearly that happens on a regular basis. How do we protect against that? But again, to say that I think service providers today are 100% secure is a little bit of a misconception as well. And when we're moving toward this world, how do we identify the best way to really attribute those types of attacks or those types of, I guess, protections, if you will, depending on the perspective, that the hackers, the criminal element, might be trying to move people toward, and we have our job to try to identify and root out those individuals. I'm thinking in my head about one of the conversations we have on a regular basis is about with respect to access to stored communications. Well, with for example a communication device like a smartphone, people will ask us on a regular basis, well, yeah, but that person backs up to the cloud. The problem with that is that what we found in our investigations is that most people don't do that regularly. Most people don't do that on a regular basis. They may not do it at all. You can clearly turn that feature off. At the same time, we also see in the course of investigations that the very tech-savvy criminal also can find out if automatic backups are occurring, or if for some reason that information is being diverted in some way off of a particular device. And so we have to be able to, I think, account for that as well in the course of our investigations.
And last question. We have, yes. Great.
Am I good? from a good friend of the FBI, Chris Segoyan at the ACLU. And I'm gonna paraphrase what came in here so it comes out in a family-friendly manner. No, I'm just kidding. His question is effectively, does the FBI use encryption on its own unclassified emails sent over the internet to other organizations? And how can the FBI engage this conversation with tech companies if they themselves are not operating at a very high level of technological sophistication? And I might add, just how do you think the federal government is doing in general in raising its own game to be able to join this conversation with tech companies in a way showing that, yes, we too are doing our own good cyber hygiene?
We need our information encrypted, obviously, and protected just the same way as the American consumer does, as companies do in the country. Clearly, you've seen as a result of recent breaches, recent hacks, we continue to focus on that. I'm not obviously going to comment on what type of encryption is employed at what level and on what systems, but at the same time, I think we as a government need to do clearly a much better job of that. And that goes back to, I think, my original point, which was we support strong encryption, as I've said, several times today. We support the strong encryption to be able to protect data, to be able to protect communications, to be able to protect conversations. But the challenge for us is, again, just to tee up the issue, what is the American public's appetite for if we go to 100% secure systems that nobody can access ever? Are we comfortable with that? Even with, in the course of an authorized investigation, in the course of trying to protect public safety or in order to prevent an attack, are we comfortable with that? And that's really the, I think, underlying question.
Great. And that's a great place to end on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.